All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. This morning we are, well, I guess this afternoon, whatever it is. Today we're going to be looking at Psalm 52, which is the next psalm in our Psalter, the book of Psalms. And Psalm 52 is another one of these psalms that basically has no liturgical connection to the Jewish liturgy. So that is an interesting thing when we encounter a psalm like that. But what I still want us to think about, if you were going to use this psalm for your own spiritual life, how would you use it? And what is the emotional resonance of the psalm? So we'll start by reading in Hebrew, and then we'll read in some translations. And here we go. Psalm 52. Lamenatseach maskil leDavid. Bivo doeg ha'adomi, vayaged l'Shaul, vayomer lo, ba David el beit Achimelech. Ma tithalel bara'ah hagibor, chesed el kol hayom, havot tachshov lishonecha, kitar milutash ose remiyah. Ahavta ra mitov, sheker midavar tzedek. Selah. Ahavta kol divrei vala lishon mirma, gam el yitotzcha lanetzach, yachtecha v'yisachacha me'ohel, v'shereshcha me'eretz chayim. Selah. V'yir'u tzadikim v'yira'u, ve'alav yischaku, hinei hagever lo yasim Elohim ma'uzo, va'yivtach berov oshro, ya'oz behavato, va'ani kazayit ra'nan beveit Elohim, v'atachti bechesed Elohim olam va'ed, odecha leolam ki asita, va'akaveh shimcha, ki tov neged chasidecha.
Short one.
Is a short one. 11 verses. Really 9 verses. Yeah, okay. Let's read some of the translations. For the leader, a maskil of David. When Doeg the Edomite came and informed Saul, telling him David came to Achimelech's house. Why do you boast of your evil, brave fellow? God's faithfulness never ceases. Your tongue devises mischief, like a sharpened razor that works treacherously. You prefer evil to good, the lie to speaking truthfully. Selah. You love all pernicious words, treacherous speech, so God will tear you down for good, will break you and pluck you from your tent and root you out of the land of the living. Selah. The righteous, seeing it, will be awestruck. They will jibe at you, saying, Here was a fellow who did not make God his refuge, but trusted in his great wealth, relied upon his mischief. But I am like a thriving olive tree in God's house. I trust in the faithfulness of God forever and ever. I praise you forever, for you have acted. I declare that your name is good in the presence of your faithful ones. Here's the Rashi Ketuvim. For the conductor, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came to Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Achimelech, which is from 1 Samuel, chapters 21 and 22. Why would you praise yourself with evil, the evil that you plot against me by giving me away to Saul? O strong one, Doeg, strong in Torah, do you not know that the loving kindness of the Lord to rescue me from you endures all the day? Your tongue plotted destruction as a sharpened razor, working deceit. You loved evil more than good, falsehood, more than speaking righteousness, which endures forever. You loved all words of swallowing, slander, the language of deceit. The Lord likewise will raise you for all time. He shall break you and remove you from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living forever. And the righteous shall behold it and fear the Lord even more. And him, Doeg, they shall mock, saying, Behold what has become of the man who did not make God his strength, who trusted in his great wealth, who took strength in his wickedness. And I, who am now being pursued by you, shall be like a fresh olive tree with children and grandchildren in the house of God, for I trusted in the loving kindness of God forever. I shall thank you forever when you have done this. I shall hope in your name, for you are good in the presence of your saints. Here's Rabbi Richard Levy. We'll read one more, and then I'll take some comments. For the conductor, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came in to tell Saul, saying to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you praise yourself for evil, brave battler? The covenantal love of God lasts all the day. Your tongue plots destruction like a sharpened razor, cutting craftily. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking justice. Selah. You love all words that swallow people up. You love a deceitful tongue. God will destroy you down through eternity, demolish you, dismantle your dwelling, uproot you from the land of the living. Selah. And the just shall watch and wonder and laugh at him. Behold, the man who has not set God as his stronghold, and who trusts in the greatness of his wealth, he shall become strong in his destructiveness. But I am like a leafy olive tree in the house of God. I have trusted in the covenantal love of God forever and ever. I shall praise you forever, for you have acted. I will hope in your name, which is good, in the presence of those bound by your covenant. All right, Mark, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, when I first read it, I said David must have been really annoyed with Doug the Edomite, and I was just wondering what was the problem with him going to Abimelech. That was one thing. Then at the end he kind of calls Doug a left-wing lunatic. Um,
Yeah, so
how can
um
you get false information like that?
yeah. All right, so there's a story here, right? There's a story behind this psalm. And the story can be found in the book of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And here's the story. The story is uh David had to flee from King Saul's wrath. This is before David becomes king. David's running away from Saul, and he takes refuge in a community of priests in a place called Nov, which is where Ahimelech, who was a priest, um, presides. And Ahimelech gives David shelter and food, and he gives David the sword of Goliath, which David had killed Goliath, but the sword had gone to the priesthood. And the priests, this house of priests, they give the sword to David. I think as a sign that they align themselves with him, that they support that they recognize the strength that he had showed in his fighting with Goliath. But Doeg is King Saul's chief herdsman. He's a courtier in King Saul's court. And he was, according to the Midrash, Doeg was a Torah scholar who whose scholarship was only superficial and didn't affect his moral character. So the Doeg is presented not necessarily in the biblical text, but in the rabbinic reinterpretation. Doeg is like a person who reads Torah, but it doesn't sink in. They might know a lot of texts, but chooses not to behave according to those texts. So Doeg, he sees that Ahimelech has given David this sword, and has given David support, material aid, and he Doeg he goes to Saul, the king, and he reports the entire episode. David came, and to the house of Ahimelech, and Achimelech gave him the sword of Goliath and offered him shelter. And the King Saul, he orders the death of the entire community of priests. He says they should all be put to death, and Doeg himself is the executioner. Doeg comes with a band of men and puts all of these priests to death, including Achimelech and everybody who was with him. And word of this massacre reaches David in hiding, wherever David is hiding. And this psalm is understood as when David finds out that this had happened, this is his response.
Oh, okay. I
So
al-
so that's the story behind this.
oh, okay. Thank you.
And you can read it yourself in 1 Samuel chapter 22 or 21 and 22. The end part, the part where Doeg puts to death Ahimelech and all of the uh all this whole priest, that's in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. Yeah, Larry.
I had a question about Doeg uh, with Abimelech. Most of I read the Samuel to see what the background was, and the translations, English translations, all use the word detained. The Lord detained uh, Doeg at Ahimelech's uh, place long enough that he was there to observe what happened. That David showed up. And it made it sound like the Lord was in a positive, not a positive, but had a reason for making this happen, and that He detained him there, and this was part of God's plan somehow to expose this guy, even if knowing what he might do, spill the beans to Saul and so forth. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? But sometimes uh things have to happen, even bad things have to happen for the story, for the purpose of the story. And so like why does this person have to die? Well, I don't know, but um it is sort of um uh yeah, it's like this question. Um so one possibility of read this is that Doeg, when it says detained, what it means is that Doeg had come there to offer a sacrifice, but he was told, you are in a state of ritual impurity. You cannot come in to offer this sacrifice. So the the netzar means detained or stopped, paused, but the interpretation of what that means, it means that he was excluded from the shrine. He wasn't allowed in to the priestly house. So interpreting it that way makes it less about God's having detained him and more to explain why he might have had it out for these priests in the first place. He was he was told, you can't come in here because you're ritually impure. So he was standing outside with his sacrifice, unable to come into the house of the Lord to worship. And because of that, he sees David arrive and he sees this whole interaction happen. And the reason why he goes straight to Saul, I mean, aside from loyalty to the current king, he also goes there because he has it out for this community of priests. Like you ask, like, why is he so willing to kill all of these people? So they gave some food to David, but interpreting that phrase, detained before God, to explain Doeg's state of mind when he went to tell Saul, that actually gives sort of another piece of the puzzle of how this massacre came to be.
The other interpretation that makes a lot of sense. The one that was sort of in my mind was when you look at how would you use this in your prayer? The last one is an affirmation that God, you have acted, and
Right.
all this is in your name, and that included the killing of Ahimelech.
Mm,
And it's almost a statement that God, I don't understand why you did this, but I know that you had something in mind, and I am happy that he was exposed, and I trust that you'll deal with him, God. But I accept that I don't have to know why bad things happen to maybe ordinary people. I just trust you, God. So I was torn between those interpretations about it.
yeah.
That he's just an evil person, not because he had a reason about David. He was sitting around in the conference with Saul and the other high-ranking guys and said, "Hey, I know something about David," knowing the terrible stuff would happen.
Yeah.
That's what was my conflicting, not sure, but I liked that interpretation because it made me feel that God has a reason for doing stuff. Maybe it was to expose even more to everybody the madness of Saul, because Saul's army guys wouldn't kill Doeg. Doeg had to go do it himself and his guys. It's almost as if they knew how crazy Saul was, so they just didn't want to get into that. And
Yeah.
you see so I was torn about that because if that's what this really means, this really is a very deep psalm, not just an acknowledgement of God acts and does good things.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I don't know. I agree with you that the psalm ends with this, you know, I praise you because you acted. You did something. And I declare that your name is good. Yeah,
You see?
yeah, I don't know. It's very interesting question. Yeah. Alba.
Okay. Or the there's this kind of thing that's running through the whole Bible or the whole, yeah, pretty much whole Bible, that no matter what happens, God did it. God decided that Joseph had to go to Egypt. And so the Ishmaelites and the Midianites get there and sell him down the river. But it all turns out okay in the end. Then there's Hosea. Hosea, in that book, it says God told Hosea that he had to marry a prostitute and have 3 kids and name them 3 horrible names like I hate you and you're ugly and you're a toad, and but in the end, everything sort of turned out okay. So that like if something good or bad happens throughout the whole text, that God made it happen, and just because we think it's horrible at the moment, it has a has a purpose to it. The I mean, Doeg just sounds like sort of like a jerk tattletale. He's there, he's got his goat, he wants to sacrifice it, they won't let him in. And so he gets to be party to a conversation. And so when he gets back to Saul, he's just like full of tales and he's just this big old tattletale. And he tells him, Saul, what's going on. Now, I'm not sure if this says that Doeg was a bad guy. I don't know. He he tells he tells Saul, but is it Doeg that puts all the priests to death?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So he's not only a tattletale and a jerk, he's just like really bad guy, and a little bit vengeful. But there was a reason for it in the end, I would suppose. The story does go on, and Saul does fall from grace, and Samuel realizes he made a mistake. He picked the wrong guy, and now let's go over to David. Maybe he's the right guy. So there always seems to be a series of events, not necessarily positive events, that take us to a positive end, like the case of Joseph, for example.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's like the events that happen, and then there's the interpretation that people give them and the way that people understand how the events have happened. Right? And the Torah scriptures that are an interesting genre because it doesn't always differentiate between the events that happened and the reasons that people ascribe to an event happening, right? So the facts of the matter are David runs away from Saul's house because it's not a good place for him to be, and Saul's really angry at him. And David hides out in various communities around the Judea. There are some communities that are that have pro David factions, and there are some communities that are Saul loyalists. And David hides out in the pro David factions, and this particular pro David faction was so pro David that they even gave him Goliath's sword as a symbol of their being, pro David. Now, from a without God involved at all, just from a perspective of, okay, there's a king. The king is currently reigning. Like, yes, the king has angered God. Yes, we know, the readers know that Saul's children are not going to become king, that Saul is going to die in battle, that David's going to end up being the next king. We know that God has torn the mantle of kingship away from Saul because Saul didn't kill all of the Amalekites, right? We know all of this, but in the moment, there's a ruling king. And the ruling king is saying that David is an outlaw. And here's a community of folks who not only give David bread and shelter, but gave him Goliath's sword, like a symbol of his military might. And one of the things that Saul is so upset about is that there's this song that people sing on the streets. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands, right? And everybody's singing this song, and it irks Saul. It's like Saul can't handle it. And this is this is a priestly village where the people, they are singing this song. They are David supporters. Oh, so this the Saul loyalist, right, wants to offer a sacrifice at the priest's village. But the priests say, nope, we can't accept your sacrifice because you are ritually impure. And so he thinks to himself, maybe I'm ritually impure. Maybe they just don't like me because I'm a Saul loyalist and they're all David loyalists, right? So he goes, he doesn't make anything up. He just says exactly what happened. He goes to Saul, he tells the whole story. Saul said, "Is this true?" Saul gets verification, and Saul orders them all put to death, and Doeg himself kills them, including all of their babies, right? The whole village, kills the whole village, 80 something people. And it's really terrible. It's a terrible story, but also, like, they knew it was risky to support the to support David. Now, this question about God, right? Like, does God want this particular village to be killed? Probably not. Probably not. On the other hand, like, if anything happens, does it happen outside of God's plan? I don't know. This is a theological question. This is like my point about the ascribing the reasons to events and not just describing the event itself, right? Does this have to happen in order to so that the public opinion turns toward David, right? Because after this, everybody around knows how crazy Saul is, right? After this, everybody around is singing the song of David has killed his tens of thousands, right? It shifts the public opinion dramatically, right? The public opinion of Judea shifts after this moment. People hear about it and they are appalled. They are outraged. How could this have happened, right? Is it God's plan that these people should be sacrificed toward the goal of having more people be David followers and David supporters? I don't know. For me, it's hard to imagine that God would kill innocent people just for that reason. But once the innocent people have been killed, then to say, well, one of the effects that has had is that it has really changed public opinion in the land. Well, I think that's a fair read. That's a fair understanding of this. And this poem, this psalm, right, is understood to be David's response when he hears about this massacre. Martha, you have to unmute.
Is that good now?
Yes.
Okay. If I can get back to the class. All right, sorry, I'll just have to stay on camera here. Okay. I have this little mantra that I always say. If one is going to study the Hebrew scriptures, this is my big banner I always keep in the back of my mind. It's not exactly the history of the development of Jewish theology, etc. It's the story of the written record of the gradual religious maturation of an ancient tribal people. And I try to keep that big arc in mind when I read it. And for any of those questions about did God do this or did God not do that, one can find many different people with many different ways of understanding scripture. If one is a biblical literalist, one might say, yes, everything that happened, or more fundamental, it's everything happened by God's specific will. I always look at permissive will as opposed to, specific will. So, yeah. Anyway, those are just some of the thoughts I always keep in mind. Gradual, over thousands of years, watching that unfold, and also the times that annihilating one's enemy was not seen as this with the same eyes that we would view it today. Absolutely can't take our modern, I'll say, Berkeley awareness, consciousness into, thousands of years ago. Yeah. Anyway,
I mean,
so
sure, except that I think that we see this in our modern period all the time, right? Like
okay.
we're not that dissimilar. Maybe we're not going to kill 83 innocent civilians if we can help it, just to get at uh one traitor. But certainly we're going to fire them from their priestly position or you know, their position in the Department of Education or whatever. Uh,
Right.
yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely
yeah,
looking at it that way. Just sort of the wholesale, you know, getting rid of those guys, just the physical, and when I look at the Akeda, it's like people are horrified. I'm like, what? What in that era, there were previous to, around that time, human sacrifice. People they found, the skulls of the babies in the, in wherever. And so for me, the big message of that was a huge sociological leap. Like it's no longer okay to do human sacrifice. Now we're going to go to animal sacrifice. That was a huge leap. Now we've got
right.
PETA. They wouldn't have loved that. But it was a huge sociological leap. But you notice that Abraham didn't say, "What? Are you crazy?" Nah, he took, because it was a normative experience in that era. He took his son up there. He was going to do it.
Yeah. And, and we know that we still send our children off to sometimes die for things that we believe in, right? That is still a part uh, of the world, and and certainly, right, in Christian teachings, they see Isaac as a prefiguration of Christ, where, okay, God's self offers God's own son as a sacrifice to expiate the world from sin. And so there, that is a very central myth, a very central story in our contemporary world. Even though as Jews, we're not so engaged by the story of Jesus and Jesus's death and subsequent resurrection, we know that that is a very, very formative story for more than 1 billion people on this planet.
Mm.
So, I want to bring us back to the psalm. Just a couple of notes about it. The When we hear about this story, when we read Samuel chapters 21 and 22, we're um horrified. We're angry. But the central emotion of this psalm is not horror or anger, right? You might think that David would be angry here, that David's response would be a deeply emotional response. After all, here was a supporter, one of his supporters, who gave him Goliath's sword, who offered him sustenance and let him stay overnight and protected him from Saul's wrath, is now they all died for having done that to him. So you might think that he would be angry. And maybe he was angry, but the central message of this psalm, the emotion, when I read it, I do not get anger. Like I have read psalms that are angry psalms. This is not one of them. And uh Rabbi Weinrib, he says, on the contrary, the opening verse of the psalm defines the psalm as a maskil, a Hebrew word which suggests wisdom, not passion. So this is a wisdom psalm, not an emotional psalm. That is because there is a lesson to the wise which David wishes to impart in our psalm. It is a lesson to individuals who are blessed with skills and talents and intelligence. David advises such people that they too can be blinded by their malice. He counsels them that they are as prone to error as those who are devoid of such blessings, right? Just because you're so smart, just because you're creative, just because you're talented, just because you have a beautiful voice, just because you are have charisma, right? Doesn't mean that you are not susceptible to making an error of judgment, right? Even intelligent people can make errors of judgment. Although brief, our psalm consists of three distinct sections, which are delineated by the word Selah, right? We know that this word signals the reader to pause and to begin the next part in a slightly louder voice. Or we've talked about how the word Selah might not be about volume, but might be about a musical interlude or whatever. However you understand it, Selah definitely adds emphasis. It is supposed to add emphasis, whether it's a musical notation or whether it's a notation about the volume by which we read it. In the first section, David tells Doeg what he really thinks of him. Why do you boast of your wickedness? You plot ruin. You love falsehood. You're not speaking the truth, right? Then in the second section, we inform Doeg, the David informs Doeg of the consequences of his treachery. Surely God will utterly destroy you and uproot you from the land of the living, right? This is not good for you, right? So first what I really think of you is, then here's what God's going to do to you. And then the end, which perhaps is the crescendo, the most emphasized part after two Selahs, the loudest part of this psalm, right? This is the reaction of the righteous to hearing about this story. The righteous will see Doeg's punishment and they will be awestruck. The righteous person will be awestruck because he too is fearful lest he also fall into the same trap that Doeg did. What was Doeg's real sin? Doeg's real sin was being attached, being loyal to the wrong king. But he was loyal, right? He did what a courtier is supposed to do. He saw what he thought was treachery, and he reported it to the king, right? This was a failure of judgment, but it's only a failure of judgment because the David faction gets to write history. If the David faction had lost and the Saul faction had won, then Jonathan would be the king, and the story that we would get would be about Doeg, the hero, who got rid of this David supporting group, right? History is written by the victors, right? The reason why we know that Doeg is treacherous instead of that Doeg is righteous is because he backed the wrong horse, okay? But he could easily have gone the other way. He thought he was doing the right thing, right? And so intelligence, righteousness, it is not always good enough. Sometimes you can think you're doing the right thing and still make an error of judgment. History might look down at you, even though you thought you were doing the right thing. The person who considers himself righteous must come to fear Doeg's fate. We always have to be worried that we are accidentally, without our own knowledge, that we are falling into this trap. We are not immune from moral error. We may succumb to the temptation that Doeg also succumbed to, right? Now, what does David say is Doeg's problem? Doeg's problem is that he trusted in his own great wealth and he grew too powerful because of his treacherous misdealings, right? This is the lesson of our psalm. This is the reason why it is a maskil, a word to the wise, and not a mizmor, not a song, right? No matter how pious we think we are, no matter how learned or prestigious we may be, We must be ever vigilant in matters of morality. We must contemplate our choices well and struggle to distinguish right from wrong. We have to try not to follow in Doeg's example. And sometimes it's beyond our control, right? I think, right, clearly Doeg, his actions were cruel, right? But part of why I think that is because I'm reading it from a David perspective. And so here's Doeg. Doeg is definitely a schemer, right? He's definitely a tattletale. He's definitely one who takes stories. But if he was taking the stories to the right side, then I don't know. I don't know. Okay, Alba.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that it was up there. I almost forgot what I was gonna. Oh, yeah, here it is. There's also the literary side of looking at these stories, you know. Sometimes I feel like when I read the story of David, it's like King Arthur meets Robin Hood, you know, there's this mess going on. But in the case of the Akedah, you are the literary side is you already know that Abraham's not going to kill Isaac. Otherwise, the Bible would have been 22 chapters long, and that would be kind of like the end of the book. And so, like, why are you reading this? So you know before you even get there that it's not going to happen. The big tension is how are we going to get out of this terrible dilemma? And so there's the literary tricks that go on and how a person interprets it. There's a few legion of books written about the Akedah, so you can pick your favorite poison. But the same thing happens here with like what you just said. I loved it. You know, Doeg, you just backed the wrong horse.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to be we have to we have to we have to live our lives like there is a moral truth. Like that we can choose a moral path. Maybe in the course of big long history, somebody will judge us for having not been moral. But we have to, in our moment, choose the best path that we can. And I think Doeg, it wasn't just that he was loyal to Saul and didn't back the right king. He also arranged for these 80 something innocent priests and their children and to be killed. And he was willing to do it himself, right? It wasn't just that he reported, right? If that was it, then okay, he was maybe trying to just be loyal to the current king. But it wasn't just that. He also was vindictive. He held some kind of a grudge against this community, and he was willing to slaughter them himself, even when other folks wouldn't do it. Larry, you have to unmute.
The evil of Doeg is confirmed when, rather than picking sides, yes, he picked, quote, the wrong side, but Saul asked his men, his bodyguards, to kill those priests, and they refused. They were obviously also loyal. This wasn't a matter, it was the punishment that was reflective of Saul's madness. That was what proved his evil intent
Right.
and his conspiracy, and he's negotiating for power and doesn't care who he kills to get that power.
That's right. That's right. The true evil of this guy is that he wasn't willing to say to Saul, yes, these people did a bad thing. Punish them, but punish them reasonably. Which Saul's other courtiers, Saul's other bodyguards were willing to say that. They were willing to say, I'm not going to kill a priest, even though the priest gave bread to David. Right? We don't kill priests over helping political dissidents. Right? Yes, they helped the political dissident. Strip them of their priesthood, like fine them money, whatever. Like, but we don't kill people over that.
And their children.
They could have just
And the
deported
children.
them.
Mark,
They could have just deported them.
right. They could have just deported them.
Isn't that what we do today?
Something like that. We could revoke their green card. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so let's look. There is one, I found one liturgical use of one verse of our psalm. Verse 10. Vani kazait ra'anan beveit Elohim, vatakti bechesed Elohim olam va'ed. So this is the only verse that I could find. It's not in our Siddur, but it is in the Sephard liturgy for Simchat Torah, where there is uh, a 5-verse anthology where each verse begins with the next letter of the word Malchut. Mem, Lamed, Chaf, Vav, Taf. So and I bolded them for you so you could see. Whoops. Okay, and here, so the first verse, all praise, I called on God and was delivered from my enemies, from Psalm 18. And then Leolam Adonai Devarcha Nitzav Bashamayim. God exists forever. Your word stands firm in heaven. From Psalm 119. For your steadfast love toward me is great. You have saved me from the depths of Sheol. From 86. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the love of God forever and ever. That's our psalm. And then from Psalm 10, you will listen to the entreaty of the lowly, O eternal one. You will make their hearts firm. You will incline your ear. And so it's an interesting set of verses because they clearly are designed to be about sovereignty, right? That's Malchut is the acrostic that these verses are saying. But unlike some sets of verses that talk about sovereignty, like Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, right? God reigns, God reigned, God will reign forever and ever, right? We say that verse along with several other verses that also have to do with sovereignty, like Malchutcha Malchut Kol Olamim. Your sovereignty will be the sovereignty of all worlds, right? Like there are a lot of verses that are actually about sovereignty. These verses are really not. Uh, so I'm very curious about who put these verses together and why these particular verses. But if I had to like read this and give a theme, it would be about the eternal trust, right? That it starts with God's deliverance, but then the over and over and over is the idea of forever and eternity and what is it that we have of eternity is in God's chesed, in God's kindness, in God's love, or in God's trust, right? So I just think it's an interesting example where it sort of overturns the idea of sovereignty. Like, what is the idea of sovereignty? The idea of sovereignty is that God will listen to the entreaty of the lowly, right? What is sovereignty? God's will show God's steadfast love toward us. What is the idea of sovereignty? The idea of sovereignty is that God's existence and God's word will be eternal. This is just a very interesting approach. So I always give us the meditation before. Oh yeah, Alba.
Oh, sorry, it just out in left field. Psalm 50 or 51 has the line, God, open my mouth and let my lips proclaim your
Yeah,
your
Psalm 51.
It's 51, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all. That's my left field question.
Yeah, last week we talked about that, or 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. The last time we had the class, we talked about that psalm. That verse, I think, is the most repeated verse in Jewish prayer. So, there are a lot of psalms that we say every day. Like that verse from Psalm 51, we say 3 times a day, every day.
Right.
So,
Is,
that is a
which verse,
very
do you know which verse it is so that this lazy individual doesn't have to read the whole thing through?
Psalm 51 is well, not off
Verse
the top of my
2,
head.
3, 4, 20.
You can Google it.
Yeah.
It'll show you.
I just want him to say
Yeah.
because I trust his memory.
Yeah.
And I like seeing him do it.
Hang on. Um, anyway, yes. So yes, that's uh yeah,
Okay.
it's 17.
Oh,
51, 17.
gonna have to look it up.
The eternal affirmation seems to be the goodness of God.
Yeah,
Both is the
I agree. I just think it's very interesting, like this verse about um being like a green olive tree. It's interesting that that verse doesn't occur in our prayer services more, right? If I was going to pick any verse from Psalm 50 from Psalm 52 that I would think would be in prayer, it would be that one or maybe the one right after it, right? The last two verses. It's interesting because of how vivid that phrase is, like the fruitful green olive tree in the house of God. Like it's interesting that that verse doesn't appear more, but it doesn't, and it only appears in this one thing on Simchat Torah, and there in a very interesting and weird anthology where the theme of the anthology is sovereignty, but none of the verses have anything to do with sovereignty or not directly, which I just think is very interesting. So, okay, I always give this meditation before saying the psalm. And the meditation here is I am stunned, shocked, disillusioned. I thought you were a pious man, an honest man, and a friend. I was vulnerable. You were in a position to help me, but you betrayed me. No punishment is sufficient for your murderous treachery. And I think, if you are going to maybe say this psalm, maybe if you were betrayed by a friend, maybe this psalm might help. And then here's the application, spiritual applications. The Psalms that purport to be related to events in David's life described in the Bible are an early form of midrash, commentary to the text itself. They are, in effect, an imagined script of what David said to another person or to God. If, as most critics believe, these Psalms were written centuries later than the events they mention, they reflect a poet who is putting himself in the place of David and imagining what the great but oft beleaguered king would say. Here, the poet makes a general condemnation of wicked people, suggesting by the headnote that wicked behavior can lead to vicious acts of betrayal, like Doeg's, if not corrected soon enough. As Doeg's sin was one of the lips, so are most of ours. Reminding ourselves that our tongues at the worst can be a sharp razor may be a way of warning us to listen more carefully to what we say and to think before we translate thoughts into speech. Can we imagine ourselves as leafy olive trees in the house of God? Does our speech yield fruit rather than crafty cuttings? Is our speech geared toward justice, knowing that merely to speak the words of justice is valuable insofar as it can lead us and others to acts of justice? Do we believe that when we speak words of injustice, supporting racism, economic inequality, discrimination against people different from us, do we know that we are speaking falsehood, undermining the truth on which God's world is based? I think that's it. That is the what Doeg's sin was an undermining of justice. All right. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you.
this wonderful discussion of Psalm 52. And we will meet again next Tuesday, the 1st of April, at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will engage with Psalm 53.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
Good
Thank
teaching.
Thanks for
Yeah,
coming.
very nice.